My name is Ann Mason. I'm the Executive Director of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's presentation. They are joining us from the other side of the Atlantic and are actually 6 hours ahead of Eastern Time. It's after 10 p.m. there, and I am so very thankful for their generosity in participating, especially at this late hour. Our speaker for today is Donald C. Carlton Jr., who is an independent curator and researcher trained at Harvard and Brown, where he earned his master's in history in 2008. He is currently developing a public history project exploring New England's multifaceted connections with the Iberian world, with a focus on the North Shore's nearly 2-century-long trading relationship with the Spanish Basque port of Bilbao. In 2013, he curated the commemorative exhibition 1763, A Revolutionary Peace at Boston's Old State House Museum. And following Mr. Carlton's presentation, Dr. Xabier Lamikiz will provide comments. Dr. Lamikiz is Associate Professor of Economic History at the University of the Basque Country. He received his PhD from the University of London in 2006, and his publications include Trade and Trust in the 18th Century Atlantic World, Spanish Merchants and Their Overseas Network, and articles on early modern Spanish trade and shipping in the International Journal of Maritime History, Hispanic American Historical Review, Colonial Latin American Review, and the Journal of Iberian and Latin American Economic History. So while we've been confined to our homes for so much of 2020, I think it will be great fun to sail away on an adventure with Captain Nathaniel Spooner this afternoon. Nathaniel Spooner was the nephew and ward of Ephraim Spooner, who lived in what is now the Spooner House Museum. And although the Spooner House, as you know, was closed to visitors this year, we've still been able to open our collections for Don, our speaker tonight, and I'm so excited to learn more about this fascinating history and how it connects to Plymouth's maritime past.
Well, thank you, Anne, for that very kind introduction. And my thanks to the Plymouth Antiquarian Society for providing this forum to share our research. Late on a Tuesday night in August 1803, the Plymouth schooner Governor Carver lay at Portugalete, a waterfront village at the mouth of the winding estuary connecting the Spanish Basque port of Bilbao, to the Bay of Biscay and the open Atlantic beyond. The Carver had been detained at Portugalete for nearly 2 days, waiting for the right combination of winds and tide to carry her over the sandbar that made the river entrance impassable at low water, and which obliged vessels of any real size entering or leaving Bilbao to hire pilots and towboats to make the crossing. In command was Nathaniel Spooner, a seasoned Plymouth shipmaster in the employ of the Plymouth firm of Thomas and William Davis. And I was interested to note that your current board president is a Davis, so I hope that I do the Davis firm give them their due in the course of this presentation. Captain Spooner had made many prior voyages to Iberian destinations on his owner's behalf, and he was no stranger to the challenges of getting in and out of the Bilbao port. At 11 o'clock that night, Spooner was called on deck, but not, as anticipated, by Portugalete's pilot major, with news that conditions were at last favorable for crossing the bar and commencing the voyage home. Instead, Spooner, who came on deck in my shirt only, unquote, found himself, quote, surrounded by a number of people who informed me that an information was brought against the vessel and that they wished to search her. Something had gone very much awry. Spooner had once written of his seafaring adventures, quote, sometimes fortune smiled, other times a hard rub, and now it looked like a hard rub was coming indeed. But first, why was Spooner in Bilbao to begin with? What had brought this son of the old colony to the Basque port and to other Iberian destinations multiple times during the late 18th and early 19th centuries? Spooner was in fact participating in what for generations had been one of Massachusetts' greatest enterprises, the catching and processing of North Atlantic cod and its export to consumers in the Old World and New, an industry whose foundational economic importance is still memorialized by the sacred cod that to this day is displayed on the State House on Beacon Hill. The branch of the trade best remembered today is the export of dried salt cod to the West Indies, where the lowest grade product, refuse or trash fish, as opposed to merchantable cod, was sold to feed the enslaved plantation workers who toiled to produce the sugar, as well as the coffee, cotton, tobacco, and indigo that yielded such great fortunes for European colonizers. Plantations in the American mainland South, it should also be noted, were also prime purchasers of low-grade cod for slave provisions. If cod's local historical importance is best remembered in connection to the so-called triangular trade, linking the Northern American colonies to Africa and the Caribbean, there were in fact two other export destinations for New England catches. One of these was Spain and Portugal's Atlantic or wine islands, which from the 17th century had become good markets for middling grades of cod. But the best merchantable product was shipped directly to Southern Europe, which essentially meant Spain and Portugal. Excuse me. The value of this European trade in cod seems to have equaled that of the much better remembered West Indian exports. The reasons for dried salt cod's striking popularity with Iberian consumers were several. As a relatively cheap source of protein that in its light dried state was easy to transport, cod was an ideal foodstuff for a region where overland travel was difficult and per capita income low. With a myriad of meatless holidays on the Catholic calendar, religious practices certainly contributed to Iberian demand for cod, although modern scholars downplay the religious element in favor of in favor of factors like cod's price advantage vis-a-vis beef and other protein-rich meats. Whatever the price combination of factors may have been, bacalao, that's my attempt to read it in both, or speak, or utter the word in both Spanish and Portuguese, which Xabier can correct, both of them, of which I'm sure, became a staple of the Iberian diet for centuries. Even today, when economic prosperity and home refrigeration make fresh fish widely available to ordinary Spanish and Portuguese consumers, salt cod has a special place in cuisines across the region. And I should note that this menu here has actually, it's a Portuguese restaurant in Vitoria, where Xabier is now, but this Portuguese style restaurant has no fewer than 17 different cod dishes on the menu. During the colonial and early national periods, a great attraction of trading to Iberia for Massachusetts and other American merchants was the surprisingly good banking relationships that buyers in Spanish and Portuguese ports, especially in Bilbao, had with London bankers. The proceeds of sales in Iberian markets could readily be remitted to London to pay off debts the Americans had accrued purchasing British manufacturers and European and Asian luxury goods for their own consumption. And here you can see a bill of exchange for a Marblehead merchant, Samuel White of Marblehead, with the London firm of Champion and Dickinson, and it has a whole list of different transactions going back and forth concerning his trade to Bilbao, but they're all being remitted to London and the accounts settled there. Yes. Another appeal of Iberian trade was the ever-tantalizing possibility of collecting one's profits in Spanish silver or Portuguese gold. The tapping of treasures flowing from the Iberian Empire's mines of Mexico, Peru, and Brazil was the stuff of Anglo-American merchants' dreams of avarice. The American colonies and their independent successor state, the US of A, were chronically short of hard money, and so any trade that promised hard currency returns was one worth pursuing. And in the disordered international situation of the turn of the 19th century, when the French Revolutionary Wars pivoted to the Napoleonic conflict, the incentive to take the money and run, as opposed to relying on international banking relationships, might have been especially strong. But carrying specie out of Spanish and Portuguese ports was a complicated and risky business because the export of precious metals from those kingdoms was heavily regulated, with unlicensed transfers of cash being punishable by death, at least on paper. In a world where policymakers still understood international economic relations as a zero-sum game, keeping precious metals from flowing into foreign hands was a high priority. Yet despite the legal risks, and with the connivance of local actors in the major ports, specie did depart Iberia in the holds of foreign vessels. The leading historian of early American trade to Iberia, the late James G. Leyden, has calculated that perhaps 10% of the profits earned came home in cash. The current slide shows the records of one 1802 transaction between the Bilbao firm of Gordia y Bao, and they were the major firm, the major Bilbao partner correspondent firm of Thomas William Davis during the period in which Spooner was active. And this split payments in half between bills in London and cash which they have supplied, which you can read. Here it says received from Messrs. Gordia Bao the sum of, lists the sum of 140,278 real vellon, which is the local money of account, part in bills on London and part in cash which they have supplied me. So in other words, this big transaction was settled half in cash and half in credits in London. So, but how did cod become such a mainstay of the Massachusetts economy? Geography played its part, of course. The New England coast north of Cape Cod, almost all of which was under Massachusetts jurisdiction prior to Maine's achieving statehood in 1820, was adjacent to some of the richest fishing grounds in the Western Hemisphere, grounds by no means just limited to the famous Grand Banks. The roots of the Bay Colony's vibrant cod fishery lay in the early 17th century, when English and French fishermen displaced the Basque and Portuguese mariners, who had pioneered the exploitation of the western North Atlantic. The reasons for their displacement are complex and still debated, but the bottom line is that even as cod became an established element of Spanish and Portuguese diets, its supply was slipping into foreign, particularly English, hands. The English cod fishery evolved into two distinct and ultimately competitive divisions, one based in Newfoundland and carried on primarily by seasonal migratory fishermen, and one based on the New England coast, largely prosecuted by permanent residents. In most historians' estimation, it was Newfoundland fish shipped to market by English West Country merchants that dominated in Porto, in Lisbon, Malaga, Alicante, and Barcelona during the 17th and 18th centuries. In these places, New England suppliers were certainly present, but they appear to have been decidedly secondary players. But in one port, the Spanish Basque port of Bilbao, was another story. There, the predominant relationship between Newfoundland and New England was turned on its head. There in Bilbao, cod from New England came to be the preferred, even dominant product for generations. New England's Bilbao connection was a venerable one, a relationship predating permanent colonial settlement itself. John Smith's New England Trials reports fish apparently caught in New England waters being sold to quote-unquote Bilbao in 1618, while a 1630 pamphlet noted that, quote, before our breach with Spain, i.e. during the 1625 to 30 Anglo-Spanish War, quote, we usually sent out to New England yearly 40 or 50 sail of ships of reasonable good burthen for fishing. The earliest primary source documentation for the trade found thus far is a 1635 letter from the manager of a fishing station at Richmond Island, Maine, acknowledging a prior order from his employers for, quote, the dispatching away of one of their vessels to Bilbao. As in Newfoundland, New England's catches were for some time brought to market primarily by English merchants, who would send big ships over here to collect the processed fish. But from the earliest days, colonial entrepreneurs made inroads into the export business. The first vessel built in Boston was sent to Bilbao with cod in 1644. And by the mid-18th century at the latest, the export trade to Bilbao was fully a locally managed affair. The merchants who came to dominate this traffic were based not in the regional metropolis of Boston, however, but in the rising ports of its north shore led by Salem and Marblehead. The area's rise to dominance has been charted by the magisterial, decades-long work of the late American economic historian James G. Leyden, who did more than any other single scholar to document and analyze the extent and importance of Massachusetts' trade with Iberia. Leyden's efforts were distinguished by his work in non-English language sources and foreign archives, something still all too rare among historians of early America, which in his case included the records of the Bilbao Consulado, formerly known as the Universidad y Casa de Contratación de la Villa de Bilbao. The Consulado was a guild of Bilbao merchants functioning in modern times as a port authority, functioning in modern terms as a port authority. And its amazingly complete archives can provide an almost complete record of shipping entering and leaving the port from 1511 to 1829. Leiden's work provides an impressive body of evidence indeed. While he found the 17th century data too fragmentary to build a statistical series for the trade's first decades of operation, for the period from 1715 to 94, he enumerated no fewer than 846 voyages for Bilbao, delivering over 100 million pounds of fish. The North Shore's trade to Bilbao reached an apparent apogee in the 1760s and early 1770s, a period which saw Bilbao shipments of over 7 million pounds of fish per annum. But Leiden's work has its limitations. For one thing, his statistics do not continue past 1794, leaving open the important question as to how long the trade endured into the early national period. Roman Larangia, however, has tallied 39 Salem y Marblehead Bilbao entries for 1795 and 32 for 100, indicating that the trade's strong run continued to the century's end, while passing reference in an 1860 history of Gloucester to, quote, that great trade in fish to the port Bilbao, which continued to a period so recent that some of our aged mariners now living were engaged in it, suggests that the trade must have persisted for some time well into the 19th century. Leiden's other shortcoming, which many of you, as loyal inhabitants and friends of the old colony, will have noted, is that he doesn't address the South Shore's participation in the trade at all. Indeed, his 2008 magnum opus, Fish and Flour for Gold, 1600 to 1800, Southern Europe and the Colonial Balance of Payments, only mentions Plymouth twice in its 300 pages, and at neither time in reference to its role as an exporter of cod to Europe. I must here confess that my own research on the Massachusetts Bilbao trade, guided by Leiden's seemingly exhaustive work, has largely focused on North Shore archives and North Shore sources. Not until I stumbled across the recently digitized Thomas and William Davis records held by the Harvard Business School Library was the South Shore on my radar screen at all. Given to Harvard by a Davis family member in the 1930s, the collection consists of one and a quarter lineal feet of material, by my rough count over 1,100 pages of documents. And in these pages, I found evidence of a very strong trading connection between Plymouth, Bilbao, and other Iberian ports, as well as the fascinating personal tale of the Captain Nathaniel Spooner. And here I should just also mention that there are important Davis materials in other repositories. There's a smaller trove of Davis materials at Pilgrim Hall, selections of which were recently kindly scanned for me by their archivist. And there is considerable correspondence in Barnstable's Sturgis Library, the latter of which is entirely unconsulted as of present by me. At present, there is still much work to be done before any generalizations about the scope, patterns, and duration of Plymouth's colonial and early national period cod exports, and their contributions to the bigger Massachusetts picture can be made. According to William T. Davis, whose status as a grandson of one of the Davis firm partners gives his testimony a special weight, quote, at the beginning of the Revolution, the cod fishery at Plymouth was active and successful, and during the previous 10 years, it employed an average of 60 vessels. In 1802, it reached its maximum of prosperity. Note this is just around the time of our Spooner adventure. In that year, there are 37 vessels engaged in it, employing 266 men and landing 26,175 quintals of cod, which by my estimation is somewhere around or a little under 3 million pounds of fish in 1 year. Ultimately, Davis does not cite any sources for these statistics, nor does he tell us anything about the principal destinations of all this Plymouth cod fish. However, it is worth noting that, again, according to Davis, quote, in 1803, the foreign trade of Plymouth was at the height of its prosperity. In that year, it was carried on by 17 ships, 16 brigs, and 40 schooners, and the duties paid into the Plymouth Custom House amounted to nearly $100,000. The possibility that Plymouth's fishery and its foreign trade peaked at roughly the same time certainly suggests that the former could have been a driver of the latter. And as to when Plymouth first connected with Bilbao, at present it's uncertain as to whether this was a development new to the 1790s, a relationship whose roots extended further back in time. The fact that the Davises' corresponding firm in Bilbao, Cordage, admonished the Davises against, quote, bringing to this market fish that is not thoroughly cured. They wrote this in September 1803, and further advised them to keep in mind, quote, the high prices fetched by, quote, well-cured fall fish from Marblehead, i.e. the North Shore, certainly suggests that the Davis firm's engagement with the Bilbao market may have been comparatively recent at the time and was not as deep or long-standing as that of their North Shore competitors. But again, we just don't know. It's an area of research really deserving further delving into. Let's now return our attention to Spooner, his biography, and his employers. Born in 1758 to Thomas and Deborah Bourne Spooner, Nathaniel Spooner became the ward of his uncle, Deacon Ephraim Spooner, at the age of 9. He thus spent some portion of his youth in the 27 North Street dwelling, now operated as a museum house by the Plymouth Antiquarian Society. Why young Nathaniel was placed in his uncle's care is uncertain. His mother died when he was 4, but he was no orphan. His father, Thomas, lived until 1800. And if the 1883 Spooner family genealogy is to be believed, paternal impoverishment cannot explain Nathaniel's transfer to his uncle's care. His father, Thomas, at source reports, carried on an extensive manufacturing business, probably in the field of shoemaking, where he had been trained, and quote-unquote accumulated handsome competency. According to the Spooner genealogy, Nathaniel began his career apprentice to a cabinet maker, but escaped those bonds to join the Continental Army in the midst of the Revolutionary War. But the sea's call evidently proved irresistible, as the genealogy explains. Quote, Nathaniel's service in the army was not of long duration. He became a sailor, was rapidly promoted, and in a wonderful short time was placed in command of a vessel. On April 4th, 1781, the ship Lausanne, this perhaps a corruption of the name of the Duc de Lausanne, who, like Lafayette, was a French soldier in the American cause, commanded by Nathaniel Spooner, was captured by the enemy, and its officers and crew were confined in the Old Mill Prison, which is a very famous prison that some of you may have heard of, both during the Revolution and during the War of 1812. It was used as a major internment center for captured American mariners. And the kicker is that it was located in the other English Plymouth. So he went from one Plymouth to another. To go back to the account in the genealogy, quote, Captain Spooner, after having made several fruitless attempts to escape, was exchanged. Returning to Plymouth, he again sought his fortunes at sea, became a shipmaster, and led a seafaring life for some years. Upon returning from ocean life, he engaged in mercantile business at Plymouth, being at one time one of the largest ship owners in Plymouth. As has already been noted, a good portion of Spooner's ocean life was spent in the employ of the Plymouth-based father-son trading firm of Thomas and William Davis. Thomas Davis, 1722 to 85, the father and senior partner, was not a Plymouth native, but had moved to the town from North Carolina sometime before 1753. But before Thomas Davis Sr. had entered into a partnership with his son William, however, he was in business with none other than Nathaniel's guardian, his uncle Ephraim. The two formed the firm of Spooner and Davis, which was active from the 1760s until its dissolution in 1774. And so the Davises would hardly have been strangers to Nathaniel when he entered their employ a few years later. Thomas Davis Sr. may have laid the international foundations of the Davis firm's far-flung trading connections during the period of his partnership with Ephraim, if one early 20th century source can be taken at face value. According to representative men in old families of southeastern Massachusetts, in the late colonial period, Davis conducted, quote, a large trade with the West Indies, Spain, France, and along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. As has been earlier discussed, it was hardly exceptional for a colonial Massachusetts merchant to be trading to the West Indies or Spain during the colonial period. But this is a tantalizing clue to the possibility that Plymouth's Bilbao connection may indeed have predated the late 1790s and have colonial roots after all. One aside about the elder Davis's activities. which will entertain you, although maybe many of you are quite aware of this story, but in 1782, one of his vessels, the schooner Harmony, was captured by none other than a young Royal Navy Lieutenant Horatio Nelson while patrolling Massachusetts waters. For a month, Nelson compelled Harmony's master, Nathaniel Carver, to pilot his ship as it cruised the waters of Massachusetts Bay, playing a cat-and-mouse game with the ships of the French fleet then based in Boston. For this good service to the British, if not American cause, Carver was given a good conduct certificate by the future hero of Trafalgar, a facsimile copy of which I believe is owned by the Antiquarian Society. And Nelson even restored the Harmony to Davis. And interestingly enough, Nathaniel Spooner named one of his own sons Horatio Nelson Spooner. So the Nelson connection there must have really made an impression on the Plymouthians. Thomas Davis Sr. Died in 1785, but the firm continued under the Thomas William Davis name, perhaps until its demise, circa 1825. During much of that period, according to William's grandson, the firm operated out of a counting house located on Davis Wharf. Whether Thomas's name was retained on the firm's nameplate out of filial piety or because Williams's brother, Thomas Jr., had stepped into his father's shoes is uncertain. But the case for Thomas Jr.'s involvement in the firm is suggestive. Some of the Davis firm correspondence held by Harvard is addressed to Boston as opposed to Plymouth. And from the 1790s, Thomas Davis Jr. seems to have spent most of his time in the state capitol, as he was a state senator representing Suffolk County, then treasurer of the Commonwealth, and also treasurer of the Boston Marine Insurance Company. As for William, he appears to have been the pillar of Plymouth society. He was a founder of both the Plymouth Bank and the Pilgrim Society, and a longtime member of the town's Board of Selectmen, and served several terms in the Massachusetts General Court. Regarding the scope of its commercial activities, the finding aid for the Davis records at Harvard summarizes the concern as, quote, a mercantile firm and import-export business in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which traded goods including fish, salt, sugar, and iron in the West Indies and Europe, while also operating a quote-unquote general store. Looking into the papers at greater depth, we can find the firm corresponding and doing business with merchants in Bayonne, and that's not New Jersey, but France, in Bayonne, Boston, Baltimore, Bilbao, Cadiz, Lisbon, Philadelphia, Pointe-à-Pitre and Guadeloupe, Santonia, San Sebastian, among other places. And additionally, shipping cacao and grains, in addition to the other items that Harvard had noted. And so now we circle back to where we began, in Porto Galete near midnight on the evening of August 1803, with Governor Spooner standing on the with Captain Spooner standing on the Governor Carver's deck, not long before midnight, clad in nothing but his shirt, and surrounded by a party of local men demanding to search his vessel. Let us turn to Spooner's own account, conveyed in his letter to the Davis firm on August 17th, as to what happened next. And I will just read a few quotes from the correspondence elucidating the Spooner's adventures here. It says, quote, I inquired their business, and when they informed me that an information had been brought against the vessel and they wished to search her, I insinuated it was groundless and endeavored to invade it, if at all possible, until the morning, but to no effect. They then proceeded to the cabin and with lanterns began their search, beginning with mine and Mr. Bradford's trunks, chests, etc. Also the lockers, my stateroom, and every part abaft, where they found 5 bags containing each $1,000. Those are 5 bags of gold. I was extremely agitated and knew not know what to do. After serious deliberation, I thought it was best to make my escape. Thus determined, I went on deck and very casually lowered down the yawl, and with 2 men jumped into her, and soon got on shore, having with me upwards $2,000 in gold. As Thomas Spooner, and I believe this must be his cousin, because I see he did not have a brother Thomas, and he didn't have a son Thomas, but I do see that Ephraim had a son Thomas, who would have been about the right age to be voyaging. But in any event, in his letter, he continues, Thomas Spooner was the only person who knew the particular state of our cache, except the mate. I took him with me. The guards from the vessel pursued us some distance, but it being dark, they could not apprehend us. I'm informed that the mate and people on board are also under guard. What will be the result, God only knows. And my greatest consolation is that I am conscious this event is not owing to any imprudence on my part or that of my people. And my absconding has been much justified by all our friends, as you will be fully informed hereafter. Mr. Bradford and my little son, for whom I was most anxious, are very tranquil. They've heard that this day they are in good spirits. And all I can do is wait the issue and determine as circumstances may aver. And it's interesting to note that he had a couple of sons that could have been at the right age to be with him. He says little son, and he does have a son. One son's like 6 or 7, but it's interesting to me that he left the son behind, but took the gold. Anyway, to continue, Mr. Mahone from Mr. Gordia's house. In other words, Mahone was one of the partners of the firm, and you'll note he has an Irish name. There are a number of Irish expat families who settled in Bilbao and became important to the mercantile community. But anyway, Mr. Mahone was with me a few hours ago, and he is of the opinion that we shall save some part of the property. Whether they will claim the vessel to him is uncertain. He thinks he may compromise for her. As soon as anything is determined, you shall be informed. He will write you the particulars of my misfortune. Well, indeed, on the following day, on August 18th, the Davis firm's Bilbao correspondent, the Davis Gordia Bao, again, Gordia Bao sent their own report of what had happened. Quote, our partner, Mr. McMahon, has gone to Portugalete in order to make use of every influence and endeavor to compromise the matter in the best manner possible. We hope in a short time to be able to get you some favorable news. It's more favorable news than this hurried report will admit of. We're happy to testify our highest approbation of the conduct of Captain Spooner throughout the whole of this very unfortunate affair. He has proceeded through the whole of this critical situation in such a manner as has not only been very justifiable in our opinion, but also in the opinion of all our friends. 11 days later, on August 29th, they wrote again to Plymouth with further news. We have been very much occupied in arranging the business in the most favorable manner that its nature would admit of, and have to inform you that the vessel having been valued at 38,000 reals vellum, we have given a bond to the amount of that sum, and have got her delivered up to us. So in other words, they paid the bond to the value of the vessel, and the authorities released it. She is now getting ready for sea with the greatest expedition possible, and will clear out in the name of Mr. Pope as captain. So in other words, the Spooner's still laying low, so the vessel's been released, but another mariner has been charged with skippering her home. The justice seems to have made some difficulty in delivering up the ship's papers, which unfortunately fell in their hands, but we are using every means possible to obtain them. Should we not succeed, however, we shall immediately write to Mr. O'Brien, American Consul Santander, for the necessary papers to allow the vessel to proceed. We hope by our next letter to be able to give you further information of our proceedings in the lawsuit for the clearing of the vessel, which will take some time and be attended with additional expense. So in other words, they're warning the Davises that this might cost a bit of money to solve this legal imbroglio. The Governor Carver indeed sailed for home, just minus Captain Spooner, who continued to lay low in Bilbao. On August 31st, he wrote his employers with further details about the circumstances of his escape. Quote, my last informed you of my singularly unhappy situation. I there stated to you that in consequence of an information against our vessel, i.e. a tip-off, they found a baft in the rear cabin, 5 bags containing cash, $1,000 in silver. Also that I made my escape. So he got the gold out, but there was a bunch of silver there that he was not able to rescue. I made my escape, and this was on the night of the 16th. On the 17th, the following day, they recommenced their search and continued searching not only the vessel, but everything on board. I had packed 5 casks of shells. I had packed in 5 casks of shells, 5 bags containing each $1,000, which was stowed in the hold. So in other words, he had purchased shells, which I'm not sure. There were a particular type of shell that you do see in trade that was ground down for its powder to be used as some sort of chemical for its chemical properties. And anyway, so he hid a bunch of this cash in these casts of shells. It says, this Mr. Gordia from their local Bilbao firm, that's the representative of, or the partner of the Davises. This Mr. Gordia hoped to save by making them a present of, say, part a third. In other words, he was willing to cut a deal with the authorities to try to get part of the money back for 30%. But with all his influence and exertions, he could not. And then he continues, in any event, when I made my escape, I brought off with me $2,030 in gold, and will recover it. And when I made my escape, and I also gave to Mr. Pope 2 packages of 50 ounces of each, or $800, and to my son 50 ounces more. Mr. Pope gave one of his 2 packages to Rufus Goddard, and he lost 41 ounces. 9 ounces, though, he saved in his shoes. The 1 package Mr. Pope kept, he has saved. And the next morning, they took from my son the package I gave him. So he does the math. So that the end of the story, from that, the $4,430 in gold, which we had saved, we now have in Mr. Gordia's hands $2,974. But on top of that, he lost all that silver. Everything that was mine they took, except my bed and a few sea clothes, my chest, trunks, books, and every paper and trifling articles, which none but those savage plunderers would have taken. From Mr. Bradford, the mate, and the people, in other words, his crew, they took nothing. The people were confined on shore for 2 or 3 days and then returned on board. Mr. Pope and my son continued on board. So the vessel, the Governor Carver, had been valued at just under $2,000, and Mr. Gordia has given bonds for that amount. So she is now in very good order and would have been ready for sea by this, but the people will still not return our papers. So there's a bit of a endeavor there to get new ship's papers so the vessel can finally sail away, albeit without Spooner. And he ends, it was a pleasing consolation to me that I was fortunate enough to make my escape, which had it not been effected, I would now surely be closely confined. Indeed, Spooner himself would not tarry much longer in Bilbao. On September 7th, he wrote in his log that, quote, this evening at 7 we came over the bar of Bilbao, after a most unfortunate voyage, being bound for Plymouth. May God of his infinite mercy and goodness send us a safe and quick passage. Spooner, as we know, did not sail home on the Carver, which had already departed under Pope, the other master. Indeed, he was probably traveling incognito as a passenger, and a carefully hidden one at that, because he could have well still been in danger of seizure by the Porto Galete authorities. That the Carver indeed made it home safely seems pretty much proven by the existence of a 1805 newspaper advertisement putting her up for sale, which you see, which has been on the screen for a few minutes now. So the Governor Carver makes his way back, and then 2 years later, for whatever reason, the Davises decide to sell her. But Spooner's departure did not mean the end of the Governor Carver legal case. Quite the contrary. Gordia Ibao would spend months attempting to recover the proceeds of the bond they had posted to secure the vessel's release, and ultimately the cost of that bond would be coming out of the Davis firm's hide. So everyone had a motivation to try to get that money back. This meant sending an emissary to Madrid, where the case had ended up and ultimately landed on an appeal to the Consejo de Hacienda, a special judicial tribunal with jurisdiction over commercial cases like this. They also attempted, fruitlessly, to persuade the American ambassador Charles Pinckney to intervene on the Davis firm's behalf. Why this gambit proved unsuccessful is as yet unknown, as is the ultimate disposition of the case, which I'm hopeful that further research may yet bring to light. But there was, in closing, another interesting twist to the story, and for that we must turn to the contemporary correspondence. In addition to endeavoring to recover the value of the bond posted for the Carver's release from impoundment, Gordia Ibao's people also continued to try to determine just who had tipped off the authorities to begin with. Finally, in February 1804, they wrote, quote, we can now satisfy you with regard to the information, i.e. the tip-off, as we have been told for a certainty that it came from 2 women, inhabitants of the town of Porto Galete. One of them is a relation to Captain Spooner's pilot, and the other the wife to one of the crews of the pilot's launch. How it could come to the knowledge of those two women that Captain Spooner had the specie aboard, we cannot guess, but think they must have been informed by the pilot or by some of the crew of the launch, from whom these last had their information from whom these last individuals had their information. It is impossible for us to guess, but it is a certain fact that the information positively did not come from any other person, either in Olivaga, which is a suburb of Bilbao and outskirts, Bilbao proper, or Portugalete, but from those identical women. And so to our story's maritime, economic, and geopolitical dimensions must be added gender relations and sexual politics. Just how did the women in question learn that Carver had specie on board? And what motivated them to tip off the local authorities? Was the prospect of a reward a motivating factor? Some desire for personal revenge against Spooner, against one of his crew, or against an affiliate of the firm of Gordier Bao? Or had Spooner done something previously to excite the ire of the local pilots and towboat crews, whose help was absolutely essential to safely entering and exiting the Bilbao estuary? The full color and complexity of Captain Spooner's Bilbao adventures may never yet be known, but there are a number of sources that are still there to be consulted. And for this researcher, at least, there is a fond hope that there is still much more to be learned. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Don. And I think now we'll have our commentator join us.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, for inviting us to give this paper. And thank you, Don, for that presentation. That was very, very good. It was fascinating. The story of Spooner is a very interesting story. Don hasn't mentioned it, but the Maritime Museum in Bilbao and the director of the Maritime Museum has joined us tonight, John Ruy Gomez. They are organizing, preparing an escape room as an activity in the museum, and the story they're using to create that escape room is Spooner's story. They are in the process of preparing that story, and I'm sure it will be very entertaining and exciting for the visitors of the museum. I like to just make just very few comments, actually. I don't want to go on for too long because we've already had, and it's quite very late here. But I just like to give you a sense of a historical context in which Spooner's ship was detained and Spooner himself had to escape. It was in 1803, the summer of 1803 is the first summer of a very, very bad 2 years for Castile, for Spain in general, because that's when a very bad famine began. The year before, harvest was bad. In 1803, the harvest was bad again. And the year after, again, it was 2-3 years in a row of very, very bad conditions. Spain lost 15% of its population due to this famine, a demographic crisis, which was made even worse by epidemic. So that's one part of the story, and this Spooner story happened in the middle of that, or the beginning of that. And then there's also another important thing that happened around this time. Remember that from 1893 to 1814, there was only 1 year of peace in Spain. That was the so-called Peace of Amiens, and that ended in May 1803, which means the situation, if you consider the situation with the bad harvests, and then the fact that the ships that could come from other countries would have it difficult to come because of the war. So provisions that Bilbao depended so much on were hard to come by. So the situation must have been very tense in Bilbao. And then there's another very interesting thing here that Don mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, and it's that the American merchants that were trading in cod and were exporting cod to Spain, and in particular to Bilbao, their idea or the structure of this trade initially in the 17th century and for most of the 18th century was that they exported this cod to Iberia so that they could then transfer the money from the sales to London or other English ports, so that they could then buy the manufactured goods that they needed in New England. And so this created sort of a triangular trade. But on occasions, the money, the silver, the gold that they needed was also transported back to New England directly. Now, the reason why at the beginning of the 19th century that would be more common was because the international war context, the situation of war, and then presumably many London merchants were in a bad situation back then. I mean, I'm sure that the New England merchants would be concerned about the standing of the London merchants due to the war, and it's very likely that they would have preferred to get that money back directly to New England rather than sending it with bills or the money itself to England. So that's another part of the story, the reason that explains why Spooner carried so much specie with him. There's another small thing too, another couple of things that I like to mention. One is in the account that we saw, half of it, bills were sent to London, and the other half was noted in reales de Bellón. Reales de Bellón actually were, I'm guessing, very useless for the North Shore merchants, because it was copper coin. The copper coin was not very appealing to anyone from outside Spain. But this is, and I think Dawn rightly mentioned that it was probably used as an account money. In reality, I'm sure it was silver, most likely silver, and maybe even gold. The reason they did that, and the other day Dawn and I talked about this, was because sometimes when they were captured, the ships, they could be captured by some English warship or by some privateer. They would check the papers belonging to the captain, and if they found accounts referring to gold or silver, then they would try to get that silver or gold in the ship. Whereas if the correspondence only mentioned other types of currency that had nothing to do with gold or silver, then the captors would be less interested in searching for that kind of money. So that's one of the reasons why they would use, that makes sense, they would use, here we can see that on the screen, reales de Bellón. Bellón is just copper, and that currency, that money was only used in the Spain itself. Spain had a lot of silver, but that silver left Spain as soon as it arrived from America and left to mostly to Northern Europe. And on top of that, finally, I like to say just a hypothesis of why these two women denounced Captain Spooner. It could have been that they had some kind of problem and then they decided to denounce him, but we can also speculate that at this time, it was very typical during the early modern period that whoever denounced any kind of crime, I mean, regarding contraband or any kind of market crime, if you denounce that and the authorities captured the criminal, and then the money or the goods that were traded were also captured, the denouncer had right to a percentage of that money in this case. So I presume that of those $3,000 or $4,000 that were captured by the authorities, the people who denounced these two women, I wouldn't be surprised if they got something out of it. So that would explain, not necessarily the only reason, because otherwise they would have done this many more times. And we know that in the past, during the 18th century and the 17th century, everybody knew that these American ships left with gold and silver to some extent. some amount of gold and silver. So I don't want to go on longer. I mean, I think I'd like to thank again Dawn for giving us such a inspiring paper. And the story of Captain Spooner is one that is very, very attractive. There's still many questions there to be answered. And I'm sure that we will find the answer to the questions. So from my part, that is it. And thank you very much. If anyone has questions, I'll be very glad. And Dawn, I'm sure, will also be very glad to answer them.
Thank you so much. That was very, that really helped
Yes, thank you, Xabier.
Answer some of these questions or get us thinking in new directions. So I would encourage you, if you do have questions for our presenters tonight, you could use the Q&A feature, or you can use the chat box to communicate with us and to share comments. I noted that one of our attendees made mention that the Davis firm actually did maintain connections with Edward Winslow Jr., who was a Plymouth merchant who was a loyalist and ultimately left New England and settled in New Brunswick. And so it's interesting to think of, there's so many different stories, I'm sure, that we could research and share about just this maritime world and how these different merchants are trading with each other, even across political divides, you know, not just national divides, but to have former neighbors who then, you know, are cast out of Plymouth, so to speak, and have to start again. But a lot of just fascinating stories from this period. And I would note, Don, that you were talking about Nathaniel becoming the ward of Ephraim Spooner. And one thing that I was thinking about was that Ephraim and his wife Elizabeth did not actually have any children in the early years of their marriage. So Nathaniel coming to live with them was actually quite beneficial to them. Maybe, you know, sort of this question of why did Nathaniel leave his family? Well, maybe it was more of a pull from his uncle and aunt, who, you know, who, of course, in that period, having children was important just for running the household. And we think that little Nathaniel would have helped with different chores around the house, like carrying water and all sorts of things like that. So it's interesting to think about that family. And ultimately, Ephraim and Elizabeth did have, they had 9 children, but only 4 of them survived to adulthood in what's now the Spooner House Museum. So that's sort of an interesting Spooner connection. And then I also just had to mention that I love that Nathaniel left his son on board the boat because I guess he figured he was safe from being arrested. You know, he was clueless about what was going on. But I think what's neat is if that son is Nathaniel's son, Nathaniel, his eldest son, we actually do know that he went on to be a ship's captain. And we have some of his captain's logs in some of his journeys in the Antiquarian Society's collection. So those are just, it's amazing again to think about how over multiple generations you do have family members who you know, follow the same path and go into the sea. So
yes, no, I think that's absolutely true. And in fact, I didn't mention that the Spooner logbooks and correspondence are actually not part of the Davis papers at Harvard, but it ended up at Mass Historical Society. And that I believe that Nathaniel Jr., I think there's a third Nathaniel, maybe Nathaniel the third, was actually president of the Boston Marine Society. So that may explain why some Spooner materials did end up in Boston. In terms of which son, I was wondering that myself. I don't think it was Nathaniel though, because he refers to him as my quote unquote little son. And Nathaniel, if I'm correct, would have been 18. Yeah. So I'm wondering if it might have been, there's John Adams Spooner, was born in 1797, would have been 6. Then he has another son, Charles Walter, who would have been 4, too young. But I wonder if it was a 6-year-old, because he does call him my little son. And I'm thinking that by the time you're a tween or whatever, back in those days, you're old enough to be apprentice. You're no longer little. I mean, you're already well on the way to the cold hard wheel of adulthood. So I'm kind of thinking it's Nathaniel would be at 18 much too old to be called the little son, but that maybe that Charles Walter would be. Unfortunately, the volume 2 of the Spooner genealogy, which has all those subsequent generations, was never published, but the notes and preparatory materials for it are in a university library out in the Midwest. I can't remember where, because I was interested in, and I wanted to research all those sons and see if any of them had a life trajectory that suggested that they might have been the one who was on board on this vessel at this time.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, just to note, the one thing I love about family genealogy is sometimes you get a sense of the family from looking at those names. And I love that there's a John Adams Spooner, which, you know, the Spooners were for sure landed on the side of the Patriots during the Revolutionary years. So that's a clear indication too. But
then there's a Horatio Nelson though too.
Right. So, you know, maybe a nod to both sides there, maybe at least a nod to a great
a nod to naval.
Right.
Well, I didn't get into it, but Spooner seems to have had a very adventurous life, and in fact, the quote of the title of the talk is actually from a song he wrote about his adventures, which is in the logbook, and he had several other run-ins, although he was never arrested. So I'm thinking, but he seems like a very audacious sort of fellow. So I'm wondering if the fact, I mean, Horatio Nelson was probably the most daring British admiral of the age of fighting sail. You know, there may have been an affinity there, the connection with the sort of risk-taking, daring character of Nelson and Nathaniel Spooner's own personality. So I wonder if that might be part of it.
Yes, absolutely. We do have a question from one of the attendees asking about Born Spooner, who was the founder of the Plymouth Cordage Company, and how Nathaniel was related to him. And we're on the right slide here, so you can see from the genealogical chart. Thanks for pulling that up again, Don. But yes. Born was the son of Nathaniel.
Yes.
And so that is one of the other sons of Nathaniel. And interesting thing about Born is that he did not go to sea like his elder brother Nathaniel. Well, he did go on several voyages, we know that, but ultimately he came back to Plymouth and founded the Cordage Company in North Plymouth. And cordage, of course, was very much a maritime industry in this period, because to have all these sailing vessels going out, many of which were made here on the South Shore, you know, you needed the rigging, you needed the rope to outfit them. And so so it is interesting that Nathaniel is a sea captain and one of his sons follows him to sea. And unfortunately, Nathaniel Jr. dies when he's in his early 30s at sea. But then you have Born Spooner, the second son, who ultimately creates this incredible company that is really an important employer, an economic driver here in Plymouth, and lasts into the 20th century. So that's how they're connected.
Yes, in fact, a mentor of mine, late Alan Rice, was very involved in the Society of Colonial Wars. His father was involved with Plymouth Cordage, and his father, I guess, maybe died in the 20s or the 30s, which it must have been one of the last generations. But he was always talking about Plymouth Cordage at the time. I was a young brat. Didn't really. But now, in retrospect, I wish I'd asked him more about Plymouth Cordage Company, because you're right, it's a very important firm and important name. And in fact, the whole maritime, you know, international trade, there's just a whole local economic ecosystem that arises to build ships, equip ships, provision ships. You know, there's a whole network of employment in activity ashore that supports those ocean-going voyages. So, I mean, and cordage is just part of it. Another would obviously be iron founding, and obviously timber harvesting and processing lumber, canvas. There's a whole range of activities that are needed to keep these vessels going and provide a lot of employment and for men and women ashore.
Well, we're at 5:40 now, so I think we probably are winding down today's program. We're getting a lot of applause in the chat, Don, so people are very
Oh, good.
thankful for,
I hope I was audible for most of it. I realize
you
I
were. Oh,
fumbled
you
the
absolutely
microphone.
were. No, don't worry about that. We heard it, and it was terrific. I will say, if you have any more comments or questions, you have 20 seconds to get them out there before we wrap up. It is very exciting again that you know, this presentation really started several months ago, or even probably a year ago now, when Don was just asking what we had in the Spooner collection, if we had anything about Nathaniel Spooner. And of course, we have his portrait, as you've seen on the slide. And what's really terrific about that is that the portrait has been reproduced and will be displayed in the escape room at the Museum. So we're just really excited at the idea of a treasure from the Antiquarian Society's collection being on display in Europe, having a European tour. And you know, you can always come to the Antiquarian Society's Spooner House Museum to see the original when we're reopened, hopefully in 2021.
Excellent. I did know. I did notice before you sign off. I did see one question pop up in the Q&A that seems to have disappeared. But someone was asking about what was "quote unquote" specium, and I realized that I may have been hard to understand. But I was talking about specie, S-P-E-C-I-E, and that's just basically another word for hard currency, gold or silver. But for whoever had that question, sorry if my enunciation wasn't as good as it should have been, but it was a specie, gold or silver.
Well, thank you, Don. And I did actually, there was one more comment that popped up. We do have the Cordage Museum here in Plymouth. I don't know, Don, if I ever mentioned that to you, but there is a really wonderful small museum with a collection of Plymouth Cordage Company materials that is in one of the old mill buildings of the Cordage Company, one of the surviving buildings. And so that is certainly well worth visiting for those of you who have never been there. Don can't visit it now, and I don't think they're open regularly because of everything going on, but certainly I do encourage everyone to go there, and it's a great collection, and certainly a great collection to the Spooner House and to the larger Plymouth story.
Yes, I did get a message from one of your members with the contact information about the museum, and I just sent her a thank you, but thanks for that good information.
Great. All right, everyone. Well, I would say thank you for joining us. Thank you, Don, for being our wonderful presenter, and Xabier for commenting. And
thank you for inviting us.
Yes, it was wonderful to see you both virtually, and thank you all for participating, and we are so grateful for your ongoing support. And with that, I would say have a wonderful evening and have a very happy Thanksgiving, as we a little bit different this year, but certainly something that I hope we all find ways to come together, even if it's virtually, with our family and friends. All right. Have a good night,
thank you again,
everybody.
Anne, for this great opportunity.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.